Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about the slave trade and the life that African Americans lived in the colonies. So we're going to start off by talking about the transatlantic slave trade. Once established, slavery expanded rapidly. During the 1700s, the British colonies imported approximately 1.5 million enslaved Africans. The great majority went to the West Indies, but at least 250,000 came to the 13 colonies to labor on plantations and in homes. Traders purchased slaves from African merchants and chiefs in the coastal kingdoms of West Africa. Most of those enslaved were kidnapped by armed men or taken in wars between kingdoms. Although they did not directly seize slaves, Europeans promoted the trade by offering high prices for captives. The Middle Passage. Enslaved Africans came to the Americas as part of a three-part voyage called the Triangular Trade. Slave traders sailed from Europe to Africa, where they traded manufactured goods for enslaved Africans. Then, in the Middle Passage, shippers carried the enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the American colonies. After selling the slaves for colonial goods, the traders returned to the mother country. So this triangular trade was a system that was set up to transport slaves to the colonies. Now, this picture here shows the deck of a slave ship. Just looking at this picture shows how they were stored, how they were transported. And as you can tell, just from these pictures alone, it was a horrific experience. The brutality of the Middle Passage was extreme. On a voyage that lasted 2 months or more, enslaved Africans suffered the psychological trauma of separation from their families and villages. As they sailed toward a strange land and an unknown future, slave traders branded their cargo with hot irons, placed them in shackles, and jammed them into dark holds so crowded that the slaves could hardly move. The foul air promoted disease, and the ill might be thrown overboard to prevent the spread of disease. Some Africans, hoping for death, refused to eat. So there were some people who were under such terrible conditions that choosing to die of starvation by just refusing to eat was better than living on one of these ships. One ship's surgeon witnessed a shocking scene. Upon the captives refusing to take sustenance or food, I have seen coals of fire glowing hot put on a shovel and placed so near their lips as to scorch and burn them. And this had been accompanied with threats of forcing them to swallow the coals if they any longer persisted in refusing to eat. Alexander Falconbridge, 1788. Slave traders had an interest in delivering a large and healthy cargo. However, due to the conditions, at least 10% of those making the Middle Passage in the 1700s did not survive. These slave ships were atrocious, terrible things to be on. And it is inhumane what these people had to go through. Some prominent New Englanders benefited from slavery and the slave trade. This photograph shows the Medford, Massachusetts home of Isaac Royal in the foreground with his estate's slave quarters in the rear. Africans in the American colonies. Following the ordeal of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans faced a bleak future in America. At slave auctions, colonial buyers often broke up families to make it more difficult to plot escape or rebellion. The newly enslaved were ordered about in an unfamiliar language and put to work beside strangers who shared only their skin color. Arriving with distinct languages and identities as Ashantis, Fulanis, Ibos, and many others, the enslaved forged a new culture as African Americans. So these people, even though they all came from Africa, they didn't all speak the same language. And the slave owners preferred it that way. You know, if all of these people don't speak the same language, they can't communicate, but it will be harder for them to organize rebellions or escapes. Enslaved African Americans in the southern colonies often worked at agricultural tasks as shown in this 1725 illustration. Slavery varies. Slavery varied considerably by region. In 1750, enslaved African Americans were small minorities in New England and the middle colonies. In those two regions, most enslaved African Americans labored as farmhands, dock workers, sailors, and house servants. Many more enslaved African Americans lived in the southern colonies where they raised labor-intensive crops of tobacco, rice, indigo, or sugar. In the Chesapeake, they comprised 40% of the population. In coastal South Carolina, enslaved African Americans outnumbered the white population. To maximize their profits, masters demanded as much work as possible while minimizing the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing slaves. Most of the enslaved lived in crude huts with dirt floors, no windows, and few furnishings. Their work was long and hard, at least 12 hours a day, 6 days a week under the close supervision of a white overseer who whipped those who resisted. So, while slavery was different in different parts of the colonies, it was throughout all of the colonies at this time, at least. A new culture emerges. In the colonies, African Americans developed a rich culture based on African traditions and their circumstances in America. These traditions represented a blend of African cultures, as plantations, farms, and cities contained Africans from many different ethnic groups. Most African Americans adopted the Christianity of their masters, blending it with some African religious traditions. They modified African instruments, crafting banjos, rattles, and drums to create a music that emphasized rhythm and percussion. Enslaved Africans resist. Slaveholders could never break enslaved African Americans longing to be free. In the South, and especially in the West Indies, some enslaved Africans rebelled. On the mainland, the largest uprising erupted in 1739 at Stono in South Carolina, where about 60 slaves killed 20 whites before suffering defeat and execution. Running away was more common. In the West Indies and Carolinas, enslaved Africans became Maroons, a name for those who hid in forests or swamps. Other runaways fled to remote American Indian villages or Florida, where the Spanish welcomed them with food, land, and freedom. Many more of the enslaved, however, opted for a more subtle form of rebellion. They stayed on the plantations, but they resisted by working slowly, feigning illness, pretending ignorance, or breaking tools. So, Florida was not part of the American colonies at this time. It was Spanish owned. And the Spanish did not have slavery. They did not have slaves. And so any runaway slaves that made it to Florida were welcomed with food, land, and their freedom. So that made it a very popular target for slaves to try to escape into. And that is going to lead to more problems down the road that we will talk about in a later chapter. Free African Americans. Although most African Americans remained slaves for life, a few did obtain their freedom. For example, an enslaved African American might manage to earn money and purchase his or her freedom, or might be set free by a slave owner. Free African Americans tended to live in cities where they faced discrimination. A rare few managed to overcome enormous obstacles to distinguish themselves. One example was Phyllis Wheatley of Boston, who published a book of poems in 1773. So whenever these African Americans would escape from slaves, they tended to live in cities after that. But even though they were technically free, they did not have the same rights as white citizens did, and they were very often discriminated against. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I will see you again real soon.